With the proliferation of the Souls-like, or Souls-born genre, we've seen games take the DNA of the From Software Golden Goose and apply it to a multitude of themes. We've seen more and more high-profile releases from veteran developers utilize the genre, ranging from high fantasy to anime, or even adapting your potentially favorite film series. Today, though, we'll be looking at more of an amalgamation of existing themes and mechanics, borrowing from the many, but also throwing a few distinct ideas of its own into the ring. Join me, brother, as we unwisely pursue Liu Bu in Wolong. Wolong, by developer Team Ninja, subsidiary of Koei Tecmo, is a Soulsborne-style action-adventure RPG borrowing thematically from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Team Ninja and Koei Tecmo are no strangers of any of this, as being developers of both a Sengoku period and Final Fantasy-style Soulsborne, and also owning the IP for Dynasty Warriors. Wolong, however, only vaguely borrows from its publisher's existing games, and even of other games of the genre outside of its scope. I will, however, try to give an initial overview without doing too much comparison and judge it by its own merits, instead leaving any comparisons to my conclusion. We start with the all-important combat, mechanically a sort of tug-of-war between you and your opponents. You'll have your typically familiar combat tools, with chainable normal attacks, complementing heavies in spirit attacks, special combat abilities through martial arts, and casted spells with wizardry. These sort of things are pretty typical of an action game, but how you apply them towards one of the core mechanics of Wolong, the spirit gauge, is key to how you approach combat. Spirit is effectively a resource that you gain from precisely applying your combat maneuvers, and is conversely lost when sloppily wasting your maneuvers or getting struck by foes. This resource applies both to you and your enemies, effectively giving you a visual gauge of how well you're conducting combat against them, with you gaining positive spirit and them going into the negatives, or how poorly you're doing, vice versa. If either you or your opponent sinks too low and hits the minimum limit of the gauge, then a stun is applied, giving opponents a chance to take a free hit on you, or conversely, giving you the chance to hit them with a special lethal strike. This mechanic is an important facet of Wolong. While weaker normal enemies can typically be dispatched with a few hits of your normal attack and a finisher, ignoring the spirit gauge entirely, the more elite type enemies and bosses will usually take a lot more normal hits to down. They will instead need to be combated through stunning them through spirit reduction, then hitting them with fatal blows instead. Most combat abilities will interact with the spirit gauge. Normal attack gives you bits of spirit while reducing the spirit of your enemy. Spirit attacks consume any positive spirit that you've incurred to both damage your opponent's spirit and shrink its minimal amount with an unblockable attack. Both martial arts and wizardry will spend a certain amount of spirit, possibly taking you into the negatives, but launches a larger attack similar to spirit attacks. Your defensive mechanics also interact with the gauge, and perhaps even more importantly so. Deflects are your sole defensive mechanic that gains you spirit. By timing these to the attacks of your opponent, you'll parry the strike, gaining you spirit while lowering your opponents, just like normal attacks. Deflecting the unblockable critical blows, effectively the enemy's version of spirit attacks, will massively lower the opponent's spirit and lower its minimum value. Blocking and dodging, on the other hand, are easier but more punishing to your spirit alternatives to defend yourself with. Blocking lets you defend from any hit that aren't the obviously telegraphed critical blows, but will lower your spirit for every attack blocked. Dodges similarly let you avoid damage while also gaining you in space, but cost you in spirit to do so. This means that deflects are your sole option for defending yourself while generating you advantage, while blocks and dodges will cost you said advantage. It's also exceptionally important to know that most of your attacks only cancel into other attacks, and can't cancel into your defensive options. You won't be able to block or deflect incoming hits while in your attack chain until the animation plays all the way through, making offense a committed affair, not something you simply fill space with. The more human-sized enemies stagger to your hits and can get locked into your attack chains with little issue, but the larger-sized enemies do not flinch, letting them launch attacks at you while you're stuck recovering from your strikes. Overall, your combat ethos changes depending on the enemy faced, but a patient reactive approach will always be the superior fallback, gaining you those sweet opportunities to deal fatal strikes for massive damage. Surrounding combat is an array of weapons and gear available for you to equip, stat levels for you to spend your combat currency on, and a wizardry spell tree to unlock through. Multiple classes of weapons are available for use, each with their own unique moveset. They're also available with no stat restrictions, so you can try all of them without worrying about your build. They're dropped or found with an RPG-style rarity roll, which offer them additional martial arts tied to them, along with randomly rolled passive effects. A full stat sheet is utilized, but upgrades of stats is simplified to 5 virtues. Spending points on these raises several stats that encompasses a specific aspect of playstyle. Whenever it's tankiness by raising extra health and losing less spirit through the wood virtue, or raw offense by increasing your spirit gain and reducing spirit costs through the fire virtue. Your virtue will give extra scaling to specific weapon classes, which means the idea of builds is still promoted, but your freedom is not restricted. Wizardry is relatively simple to learn, with most of them easily learned through a spell tree using points earned through leveling your virtues. Your ability to use them, however, is restricted by your virtue level, corresponding to the wizardry tree you're learning from, and also by Wolong's unique mechanic, morale level. Wolong effectively has two leveling systems, between your standard levels gained through your gains of virtue, and also morale, which is a form of on-field level. Every mission begins with your morale at 0, and gains in levels through combat and discovering the two varieties of flags, Wolong's version of checkpoints, battle flags or the traditional checkpoints, acting as your respawn and fast travel points. Marking flags do not have these functions, but both will raise the minimum morale level that you drop to on death. These levels passively affect your battle effectiveness compared to your opponents, who also have their individual morale levels. You'll deal more damage and take less from opponents with lower morale, and vice versa, dealing less and taking more from those with higher morale. Assuming you explore the missions appropriately, you'll naturally gain levels and checkpoints over the course of the map, allowing you to combat the higher and higher morale level foes you'll meet the further you go. These levels are dynamic, however, and will go up and down for both you and your enemies in response to changes of state. Morale will drop from hits from spear attacks and critical blows, which means you can skew things to your advantage against those with high morale, especially at bosses, or you will get severely punished from failing to avoid attacks, dropping all the way down to your current stage minimum upon your death. Morale gives you a dynamic option to approach missions. You can go for a standard method, dispatching opponents and picking up flags as you explore the environment, allowing your morale to scale up naturally to tougher encounters. If you're struggling with certain enemies, on the other hand, you could choose to grind up your morale and attempt to brute force your way through them with superior efficiency. You could also choose to do the opposite, foregoing the hunt for flags and instead relying on your own ability to avoid damage and steadily drop your opponent's morale to your own level. Either way, you'll be exploring Wolong's Dynasty-era world towards your goals, allying and combating with characters pulled from the legends of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Though perhaps lacking in the sort of high fantasy that you'll find in its genre's compatriots, the world of Wolong feels appropriate to its theme, finding you in lush green forests, small countryside communities, frozen-scarred battlegrounds, and sprawling fortress cities in your quest. The overarching plot throughout Wolong is relatively unique to itself, but the happenings surrounding it follows rough similarities with its source, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Your typical historical characters star in their appropriate roles, along with a handful unique to the game. Both the story and the character arcs, however, run through quite a brisk rate. Generally, before and after missions, you'll be subjected to a short plot dump that explains why you're currently functioning where you are and why you're moving on after. Characterization happens during these relatively brief scenes, and while they do act appropriate to their source, thanks to the very brief screen time the multitude of characters have for themselves, it all feels mildly rushed. I do, however, appreciate the battle animations, both in gameplay and also of the choreographed cutscenes, as they hark quite closely to the historical dramas featuring the same source material or timeline, featuring acrobatics, soaring strikes, and free-flowing motions. There are, however, a few things in Wolong to keep in mind when it comes to your overall experience. The tutorial feels mildly inadequate, which especially becomes apparent for some as you swiftly meet your first boss challenge, which becomes a familiar gate for many. Spirit mechanics, being an important overall facet, would have helped with some more controlled tutorials, and the inability to cancel combat actions into defensive actions is something especially important to know, but isn't noted within the tutorials. The allies that join you in most missions throughout the story have pretty poor AI, though you'll generally not need to rely on their assistance. It's a little amusing to watch fearless Guan Yu completely refuse to harm horses, or genius tactician Cao Cao charge straight into a poison swamp in his thirst for blood. In some cases, they'll overextend their chase after opponents, drawing the aggression of a few too many opponents towards you. Multiplayer is relatively simple, which could be a good or bad thing depending on what you're looking for. Cooperative play is available, but only through private invites as co-op matchmaking is unavailable. Competitive play is basic, relegated to simple invasions, common for the genre, but there isn't much incentive to do so. For myself, invasions barely happened, but you do have the option to turn off invasions completely if you wish. There's one other multiplayer aspect available in flags that spawn in your world through the death of other players in their own games. You can interact with these by offering a charge of healing to temporarily boost your morale level at your attempt to avenge them. This comes as an interesting mechanic, but generally gets utilized less and less as you go. Now with all of that put together, let me share my own personal opinion. Wolong is an interesting amalgamation of several games within this genre, though most of its mechanics compare closest to Team Ninja's own Nioh and From Software's Serico. Most combat that isn't against the easily dispatched fodder who gets easily stun-locked generally revolves around learning enemy attack patterns to deflect and correct parry timings, instead of the movement and positioning focus more common in the genre. I've generally felt that Wallong has relatively generous deflect timing, and once I learned how you could not cancel into deflects from attack chains, and thus spent more of my time patiently deflecting hits for fatal strikes instead, I generally did not find myself struggling as much. Difficulty and adaptation of skill, however, varies between people, so it wouldn't be too fair to simply call Wallong an easier Souls-like game. Instead, I would say that Wallong is a simpler game within its genre, developed to a AAA standard. Your combat loop is simpler, the story is simpler, stat distribution is simpler, and even exploration is more simple versus games of similar style. But that simplicity is not a negative. For people who want to play a game within the Soulsborne style, but finds themselves dropping off because of dense combat mechanics, stats, or exploration, will find an easier to experience game through Wallong. Genre veterans, however, will have to consider if theme and style of combat interests them before committing to this game, as the simpler systems may or may not turn off those who are already experienced in the genre and are looking for more. As such, I can recommend Wallong to most, though not easily to all. I would recommend first trying the game, utilizing Steam's 2-hour refund policy, or playthrough, as of time of recording, Game Pass. And there is today's review. Thank you for sticking to the end, and thank you everyone for helping me reach triple-digit subscribers. Here at Second Opinion, we try to promote giving games a second chance, looking through the issues of games, and to focus on what sort of core enjoyment you'll find within them. Thus, we serve best as a second review, used to affirm yourself whenever or not a game will be for you. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then help us out by dropping a sub down below, liking the video if you enjoyed it, and leaving some of your thoughts on the game or channel in the comments below. We also stream most days on Twitch at twitch.tv/secondop. That's second op with the number 2, where we show off newer releases and the more underrepresented older games of times past. Following us on that channel also helps me out a lot. And most importantly, enjoy more games.